Chair appreciates the remarks. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
I thank the chairman. I believe this week we're going to be voting on suspension on a bill that is a resolution that would be original jurisdiction in this committee, which is the task force to investigate the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. And I saw here that was mentioned in the media that one of the Democrats who might be on this task force is here testifying in front of us today. I want to give him a chance to respond to a few things. I believe it was Mr. Thompson's staffer who suggested that the would-be assassin should have taken shooting lessons. I believe it is Mr. Thompson who has introduced a bill that would, according to his own fact sheet, remove the Secret Service protection from President Trump. I believe it was Mr. Thompson who was very unhelpful I would go so far as to say, helped the Secret Service when they deleted their phones, helped them to cover up what happened on January 6th, failed to get to the bottom of the pipe bomb investigation. We still have no leads there, and I think I want to give him a chance to respond to all of that, since his name is the only name the Democrat that has been mentioned in the media as serving on this task force.
Well, I thank the gentleman for giving me the time. This notion that the media is somehow the authority baffles me. Just like you were talking about reports on the border czar. All the references had to do with the media. There's no authority to go with it. But more specifically, that employee who made that unfortunate statement is no longer with me. The moment it came up, she was discharged. With reference to the legislation, which was introduced before the former President Trump was convicted, speaks to everyone who is a protectee, that is a convicted felon and is sentenced to jail. That is the only reference in the legislation. So if those 34 counts, felony charges that President Trump has been convicted of, if he's sentenced to jail, then there's no reason for the Secret Service to go to jail with him when he's in the custody of whatever correctional department that's there. So, I mean, that's the point there. When he comes back out, he's fine, he gets it. But the legislation is specific to that. Now, if you read in the media point, that's another point on that. So
you're not concerned about his safety if he were sentenced to jail? And if
I'm concerned that he's a convicted felon.
What if he were sentenced to house arrest? Would your legislation trigger the removal of his Secret Service protection?
To house arrest?
Yes.
No.
It says on, the fact sheet that you put out, it says upon following conviction.
Yeah, but it doesn't say anything about house arrest.
Yeah, but that would be the conviction. If he's convicted, once you're convicted.
Well, I suggest you read the bill. If you look at the bill, you say that if he's convicted and sentenced to jail, it does not talk about house arrest.
Well, I think I would hope we could be more sensitive to that and that there wouldn't be any resolutions here in Congress to remove a former president's Secret Service protection under any situation. And I just think it would be inappropriate for somebody who has a culture in the office of his congressional office of suggesting the president's Secret Service should be removed, and having a staffer who suggested that the shooter should have taken shooting lessons. I think it would be inappropriate to have that person serve on this task force. And with that, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back the gentleman.
I'll yield some time to a good friend, Mr. Massie.
I thank the gentleman from South Carolina. Mr. Thompson, I went and looked back at your legislation that would remove Secret Service protection, and it doesn't say anything about reinstating it after the conviction. It says the protection authorized in paragraphs 1 through 8 shall terminate for any person upon sentencing following conviction for federal or state offense that's punishable for a term of imprisonment of at least a year. You want to...
Well, I'm telling you what the power that's inherent in the DHS secretary is when that person comes back, all that person has to do is reinstate the service.
But yours removes the service.
That's right.
And your legislation doesn't say whether they go to prison or not. It says if they are convicted for an offense that's punishable for a term of imprisonment of at least 1 year. Now, a lot of people get convicted of things that are punishable for a term of imprisonment of at least 1 year and don't go to prison for that. And so what I'm talking about here is this circumstance where your legislation very clearly, whether Trump serves time in jail or not, upon conviction, and he is already convicted, but upon sentencing, regardless of what that sentencing is, upon sentencing, your legislation takes away his Secret Service protection and does not give it back.
He is a convicted felon. He has been tried by his peers and found guilty. I don't think we need to reward a convicted felon with Secret Service protection if they are sentenced to jail. Now, if they are sentenced to house arrest or something like that, but in the normal course of a trial, normally the judge refers that individual to the custody of whatever the correctional facility is.
With the gentleman from Kentucky.
Yes, I'll yield to the attorney.
My read of it and my staff's read of it is as is the gentleman from Kentucky, is that it applies after sentencing and conviction for a crime punishable by a year in prison, but it does not require the prison sentence. It would apply, for example, to a sentence of probation. So I think these are real issues with the legislation. I yield back to the gentleman.
So he could even, receive probation or house arrest and or community service.
Right.
And your legislation would remove his Secret Service protection, and it could be triggered by a state, not even a federal offense. So we would take away federal protection for a duly elected president who served his term based on what some state does, based on your legislation, whether he serves any time or not. I think you should withdraw the legislation. I think you should, it might have sounded good at the time, but I think that all of this country sees that it's a very bad idea at this point.
Well, it applies to anyone who's a protectee, not just former President Trump. If any person who's presently a protectee is convicted of a felony and sentenced to jail, they lose protection. It could be former President Obama, it could be former President Bush, or whomever. It has no specific direction to President Trump.
But your fact sheet does. It says, will this bill apply to former President Trump if he's convicted of a felony? It doesn't say anything about Obama or Clinton, and it says this measure would apply to former President Trump. We all know, every one of us here knows that your bill was introduced to remove President Trump's Secret Service protection. The man has just had an assassination attempt on his life, and I think you should withdraw the legislation.
Well, he had Secret Service protection in Butler, Pennsylvania. My legislation would not have prevented that if, in fact, he is sentenced to jail. He will be protected.
But if he's sentenced to probation or community service,
It has no bearing
that is
on
not
losing the Secret Service.
yeah, that's not what, I mean, we all write laws here, and we all know that's not how the legislation reads. So I think it would be a good gesture. It'd bring our country together. It would set the right culture among your staff and everybody else's staff if you would withdraw that legislation.
Let me be clear. We're a nation of laws. Any man that's convicted of 34 felonies and under my legislation and sentenced to jail, then he does not need Secret Service protection in jail because he's under the custody of the Department of Corrections, plain and simple. Now, when he gets out, in the discretion of the Secretary of Homeland Security, he gets it back. I would recommend he gets it back. But I don't think we have to say bad behavior. We need to reward it with Secret Service protection. You are a convicted felon.
Would the gentleman yield?
It's Mr. Norman's time, if you would like to yield to.
Yield.
Don't you believe, Mr. Thompson, that given the fact that one of your staffers had a very murderous sentiment at a very, emotional time for the country with the assassination attempt on President Trump, that it would just be in good faith to withdraw a bill with such a sentiment? I mean, let's face facts. President Carter is about to celebrate his 100th birthday. I have strong doubts that he has a lot of threats on his life, but he has a detail every single day. There are only 46 presidents of the United States in the history of this country, and your staff very publicly called for the killer to have a better shot. That was in your office. Don't you believe it would be in good taste to withdraw this bill at this time? I yield back.
And before you get back to Mr. Norman, I would give you a chance to answer that.
The staffer's comments were unfortunate. She's no longer with me, and that's it. I didn't discuss a private Facebook posting, but when I became aware of it, she's no longer in my employ.
Well, just tying it back to the legislation that would be original jurisdiction of this committee, I do think it would be inappropriate for somebody who's got legislation to remove Secret Service protection from a former president to serve on the committee that's going to investigate the Secret Service and how there was such a lapse in the security of this very same president that he's targeting with his legislation, of the very same president that his staff wished ill thoughts upon in a social media post. With that, I yield back to the gentleman from South Carolina.